A cold wind snaked through the crowded streets of downtown, carrying with it the smell of food from nearby diners and coffee shops. The sidewalks buzzed with people going about their day. Shoppers, professionals on lunch breaks, tourists clutching cameras and maps. Amidst the bustle of urban life sat a man whose presence was almost invisible to everyone around him, as if he were just another piece of the city's backdrop. Thomas Bell, or Tommy, as he preferred, sat on the steps of a small, bustling diner, his coat patched and frayed, his fingers blue from the chill. His skin was dark, his beard unkempt, and his eyes bore a weariness that even sleep couldn't wash away. Despite the hardship evident in his appearance, there was a quiet dignity about him. His face, weathered and lined, held stories of sacrifice and struggle that the passers-by could scarcely imagine. A cardboard sign lay propped up against his knees with scrawled words, "Homeless veteran. Hungary. Anything helps." Occasionally, a person would glance down at the sign but quickly avert their eyes, unwilling to let his situation intrude on their day. Others walked by without a second glance, absorbed in their lives. Tommy had grown used to this invisibility. He wore it like a second skin. People only saw what they wanted to see. A homeless man, a beggar, someone who'd failed to make it. They had no idea of the paths he'd walked, the sacrifices he'd made, or the price he'd paid. Tommy hadn't always been homeless. Once, he'd been a young man with boundless ambition and an unwavering commitment to serving his country. Growing up in a tough neighborhood in the South, he'd always dreamed of a life beyond the streets he called home. Joining the military was his way out, his path to a brighter future. He enlisted right after high school, fueled by the desire to protect the people he loved and make a name for himself. The uniform had been a badge of honor, one he wore proudly. He'd served with distinction, completing multiple tours in war zones, earning the respect of his comrades, and even a few medals for bravery. His fellow soldiers had become like family, their bonds forged in the crucible of combat. Out there on the battlefield, it hadn't mattered that he was a black man from a poor background. They were all brothers, fighting for the same cause. But when Tommy returned home, he found himself fighting a different kind of battle, one that he was wholly unprepared for. Civilian life was harsh and unforgiving. Jobs were scarce, especially for someone with his background and appearance. Employers saw his race before his achievements, his skin color before his medals. Gradually, he lost what little stability he'd managed to find. The pride he'd once felt wearing his uniform turned into a hollow reminder of a past that society seemed to want to forget. Years went by, each one harder than the last. Eventually, Tommy found himself on the streets, surviving day by day, his pride slowly eroded by hardship and indifference. But through it all, he clung to the memories of who he'd been. He kept his medals tucked away in a battered, old case hidden deep in his backpack. It wasn't for others to see, not anymore. It was a reminder for himself, a relic of a life that felt worlds away. Today was like any other day, with Tommy sitting on the diner steps, the sting of the winter wind biting through his thin coat. His stomach grumbled, but he tried to ignore it. He'd learned to be patient, to wait and hope that someone, anyone, might spare a little kindness. Inside the diner, families laughed and chatted over warm plates of food, steam rising from cups of coffee and bowls of soup. The smell wafted outside, torturing him with the promise of warmth and comfort. Tommy tried not to think about it. Hunger was a constant companion, and over the years, he'd learned to push it to the back of his mind, just as he'd learned to ignore the stares, the whispers, the occasional cruel remark. As he sat there, a young boy emerged from the diner with his mother. The boy paused, looking curiously at Tommy, his innocent eyes taking in the man's worn clothes and the sign at his feet. "Mama," he asked, tugging on her coat, "why is that man sitting out here?" He looked sad. The mother glanced at Tommy, her gaze lingering for a moment before she tugged her son away. "Don't stare, honey," she murmured, casting a final look at him. "Just keep walking." Tommy watched them go, a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the sting of judgment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. To most people, he was a nameless face, a burden on the sidewalk, someone they could dismiss without a second thought. But what they didn't know What they couldn't see was the man he had been, the hero he still was, somewhere deep down beneath the layers of hardship and loss. And though Tommy kept that part of himself hidden from the world, there was a part of him that longed to be seen, to be recognized, if only for a moment. As the day wore on, Tommy huddled deeper into his coat, bracing against the wind. He felt the familiar ache in his bones, the numbness that crept into his fingers and toes. But he kept his head held high, even as people continued to walk by without a glance. After all, he had survived worse. And though the world might have forgotten him, Tommy hadn't yet forgotten himself. Tommy Bell was no stranger to hardship. Born and raised in the unforgiving neighborhoods of Detroit, he grew up in a world where opportunity was scarce and struggle was an everyday reality. His mother, Marlene, was a resilient woman who worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. She was a proud woman, never letting on to young Tommy how hard life was for her. But as he grew older, Tommy began to understand just how much she sacrificed to give him a fighting chance in a world that seemed determined to keep them down. Tommy's father had been out of the picture since he was a child. He barely remembered the man, a shadowy figure he could only recall from an old family photo, faded and worn. But his mother more than filled that gap, instilling in him a fierce determination and an unbreakable sense of loyalty. "Don't let this world take you down, Tommy," she'd say, brushing his hair with gentle fingers after long days. "You got something in you, something special. And when the time's right, you'll show the world what you're made of." Despite his mother's encouragement, Tommy's early years were far from easy. The streets were rough, filled with gangs, drugs, and a sense of despair that clung to the neighborhood like a thick fog. Many of his friends from childhood found themselves drawn into the cycle, caught up in crime or worse. But Tommy held on to his mother's words like a lifeline. He knew he wanted something different, something better, not just for himself, but for her, too. High school was where he found his first true mentor, a history teacher named Mr. Lawrence. Seeing potential in Tommy, Mr. Lawrence took him under his wing, encouraging him to pursue something beyond the narrow confines of his neighborhood. He saw the spark in Tommy's eyes, the hunger for a better life, and he did everything he could to fan that flame. Through Mr. Lawrence's stories of bravery and sacrifice, Tommy first learned about the men and women who served in the military. He found himself captivated by their tales of courage, and a seed was planted in his mind. A thought that maybe, just maybe, the military could be his way out. By the time he graduated high school, Tommy knew what he wanted. He enlisted in the Army, much to his mother's mixed feelings. On one hand, she was proud that her son had found his calling. On the other, the thought of him in harm's way made her heart ache. But she knew this was what he needed, and so she stood by his decision, offering her unwavering support. When Tommy shipped off for basic training, he felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. The challenges of military life were tough, but Tommy was tougher. He pushed through grueling days, learning the art of resilience, discipline, and loyalty. The brotherhood he formed with his fellow soldiers was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Out there, on the training grounds and later on the battlefield, race, class, and background didn't matter. They were all there for the same reason: to protect each other and serve their country. Tommy rose through the ranks quickly, gaining the respect of his peers and superiors alike. His squadmates often joked that he had a guardian angel watching over him. No matter how dangerous a mission, he always seemed to come back unscathed. But Tommy knew it was more than luck. He carried with him his mother's strength, the lessons from Mr. Lawrence, and the drive to prove himself. The culmination of his service came during his 3rd deployment. His squad was ambushed in a remote village, surrounded by enemy forces with no way out. Tommy's actions that day saved lives. He led his squad through enemy lines, securing their safety against all odds. For his bravery, he was awarded the Silver Star, a medal he kept close as a reminder of both the honor and the burden of his service. But returning home after his years in the military wasn't the triumphant experience Tommy had hoped for. While he was greeted with handshakes and thanks for his service, the transition to civilian life was brutal. Employers didn't see a hero. They saw a black man with a military background, someone who didn't fit neatly into their preconceived ideas. The medals and honors he'd earned meant little to them. Despite his years of service, despite his sacrifices, the doors he'd hoped would open remained firmly closed. With each rejection, Tommy's spirit wore down. His savings dwindled, and soon he found himself without a stable income or a place to call home. The brotherhood and purpose he'd found in the military were replaced by the harsh reality of homelessness. The world he'd fought to protect turned its back on him, and he found himself invisible in a society that seemed all too willing to forget his sacrifices. Yet, even as he struggled on the streets, Tommy refused to let bitterness consume him. He still wore his old army jacket, the same one he'd had during his tours, with pride. The medals he kept tucked away in his backpack weren't for display. They were a quiet testament to the man he'd been, the man he still was. When he spoke to other homeless veterans he met along the way, he offered them a kind word or a shared meal, small gestures that reminded him, and them, that they were not forgotten. One such friend was Eddie, an older vet who'd served in Vietnam. Eddie and Tommy shared stories of their service, their struggles, and the unspoken bond that only veterans could understand. Eddie would often joke, "You're too young to be out here with the likes of me, kid. You still got fight left in you." Tommy would smile, but deep down, he wondered if that fight had been drained from him. Yet, in those quiet conversations with Eddie, he found a semblance of the brotherhood he'd lost. As he sat outside that diner on a cold winter day, Tommy's mind drifted to thoughts of his mother, the promises he'd made to her and to himself. He could still hear her voice, urging him not to let the world defeat him. And though life had worn him down, that spark, however faint, remained, a flickering ember of the man he'd been. The diner bustled with the usual crowd of locals and travelers seeking a warm meal on a brisk afternoon. Inside, conversations flowed over clinking coffee cups and the smell of fried bacon. Tommy lingered outside, braving the winter chill as he glanced through the large windows. Despite the layers of his worn army jacket, the cold seeped through, nipping at his skin. His mind debated whether to enter, wondering if today would be any different. Pushing the door open, Tommy felt the warmth of the diner hit him like a wave. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on a lone table in the back, near the heater. An older waitress caught his eye, her expression softening as she took in his rugged appearance and the unmistakable military patches on his jacket. She walked over with a half-smile, her pen poised over her notepad. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity. Tommy nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And maybe just a small bowl of soup." She gave him an understanding look and scribbled the order down, her eyes lingering a little longer than necessary. He could sense her pity, a look he was all too familiar with. Though it stung, he brushed it off, focusing on the steam rising from the cup she placed before him. He wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep through his fingers, soothing his cold skin. Across the room, the door chimed, and a well-dressed man entered, glancing around with an air of impatience. He was clearly out of place among the regulars, his tailored suit and polished shoes contrasting sharply with the casual atmosphere. He scanned the room, his gaze narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of Tommy in his worn jacket, his face unshaven, his expression weary. The man took a seat a few tables away, and the waitress quickly shifted her attention to him, her tone taking on a more professional edge. Tommy didn't miss the slight change in her demeanor, nor the sideways glances some patrons shot his way. He kept his head down, focusing on his coffee, trying to drown out the discomfort that gnawed at him. As Tommy waited for his soup, he overheard bits of the man's conversation with the waitress. The man's voice carried an edge of entitlement, speaking loudly enough that it was clear he wanted to be heard. "Make it quick, will you?" he snapped as she took his order. "I don't have all day." The waitress handled his attitude with patience, though Tommy could see the subtle tightening of her jaw as she scribbled down the order and hurried back to the kitchen. The man's gaze drifted to Tommy's table, lingering with a look of disdain that made Tommy's stomach tighten. He was no stranger to these types of stares, the judgment, the assumptions, the unspoken contempt. Tommy took a steadying breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He'd learned long ago to pick his battles, to hold his tongue when pride tempted him to speak. The years had taught him that silence was often the strongest defense, even if it left a bitter taste. Minutes later, the waitress returned with the man's order, a steaming plate of steak and eggs. The man barely acknowledged her, digging in with an air of indifference. Tommy's soup arrived shortly after, a small, humble bowl with a single slice of bread on the side. He whispered his thanks to the waitress, giving her a nod of appreciation as she moved on to the next table. As he sipped his soup, savoring the warmth it brought to his empty stomach, Tommy couldn't help but notice the man occasionally glancing his way, a look of irritation on his face. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the meal in front of him, but the man's voice soon broke the quiet between them. "You know," the man said, his tone laced with disdain, "it's a shame to see people like you just loitering around. I mean, some of us work hard for what we have." Tommy's grip on his spoon tightened, his jaw clenching as he struggled to keep his composure. He'd faced down worse, endured insults and judgments from people who saw only the surface, who never bothered to look deeper. He wanted to tell this man that he'd earned every scar, every line etched into his face, that he'd served his country with pride, putting his life on the line so people like him could live in peace. But he knew it would fall on deaf ears. "Some people," Tommy replied quietly, keeping his voice steady, "have worked harder than you'd imagine." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, please. You expect me to believe that? Sitting here, begging for scraps. Pathetic." Tommy's heart pounded, his mind flashing back to the days in the trenches, the sound of gunfire, the faces of his fallen comrades. The disrespect in this man's words cut deeper than any weapon, striking at the core of his dignity. Yet, he reminded himself that this man could never understand. He'd never know what it meant to sacrifice everything, to come back to a country that had little left to offer. The waitress, sensing the tension, stepped in, her voice gentle but firm. "Is everything all right here?" The man waved her off dismissively. "It's fine. Just teaching a lesson to those who need it." Tommy met her gaze, giving her a small nod, silently reassuring her that he could handle it. He knew this was just another battle in a war he'd been fighting his entire life, a battle for respect, for understanding, for dignity. The man finished his meal and stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table without a second glance. He shot Tommy one last disdainful look before heading toward the door. Tommy watched him go, the sting of his words lingering, but he held his head high, refusing to let the man's judgment tarnish his spirit. As the waitress came over to clear the man's table, she paused by Tommy's side, offering him a sympathetic smile. "I'm sorry about that," she said softly. "Some people just don't understand." Tommy nodded, managing a faint smile in return. "It's all right. I've seen worse." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the ache in his chest, the feeling of being unseen, undervalued. He'd fought for so much, for his country, for his fellow soldiers, for his own survival. And yet, here he was, treated as if he were less than nothing. As the hours ticked by, the diner grew quieter, and the evening crowd started to thin. Tommy lingered, finishing his last sip of coffee, savoring the warmth of his seat by the heater. The waitress stopped by occasionally, refilling his cup without him asking, offering small smiles that conveyed understanding without words. Just as he was about to stand up and leave, the door chimed again. To his surprise, the man from earlier, the one who had openly disrespected him, stepped back inside. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman in an elegant coat and 2 children followed him, chatting with excitement. They all settled at a booth near the front, laughing as they perused the menu. Tommy's gut tensed as he watched the scene unfold. The man's demeanor had softened in the presence of his family, his harshness replaced by a warmth he hadn't shown earlier. He spoke in gentle tones to his children, his previous arrogance nowhere in sight. For a moment, Tommy wondered if the man even remembered him, if the bitterness from earlier had simply been a passing moment in his day. The waitress brought their meals quickly, and they started to eat. Tommy couldn't help but notice the man glance in his direction, his expression unreadable. Part of Tommy wanted to leave, to escape the painful reminder of the division that had marked his life for so long. But another part of him stayed rooted, as if he was waiting for something he couldn't quite put into words. Moments later, as the man rose to pay, his eyes met Tommy's across the room. This time, there was no sneer or contempt, only a look of faint recognition, as if he were finally piecing together a story he hadn't understood before. The man paused, his wallet in hand, and hesitated before walking over to Tommy's table. "You're still here," he said, his tone less confrontational, almost curious. Tommy looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. "Seems like it," he replied, his voice calm but guarded. The man shifted awkwardly, glancing around before clearing his throat. I may have been out of line earlier," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Didn't realize, well, never mind." Tommy raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanged. "Didn't realize what?" The man hesitated, his eyes flickering over Tommy's jacket, the worn patches that hinted at a lifetime of service. "I didn't realize that you served." Tommy gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Does it make a difference?" The man's face flushed slightly, and he ran a hand over his mouth. "Look, I didn't mean to be rude. I just thought." Tommy interrupted him, his voice steady. "You thought I was just another bum, didn't you? Just another man on the street with nothing to offer." The man looked down, ashamed, as if Tommy had hit on a truth he wasn't ready to face. "I didn't know," he admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Tommy watched him for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of pity and frustration. "Knowing wouldn't have changed much, would it?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a weight of experience that seemed to make the man falter. Just then, the waitress came over, watching the exchange with a sympathetic gaze. She placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, as if silently offering her support. "This man," she said, her voice directed at the stranger, "didn't just serve. He saved lives. I've heard his story over the years. He's done things most people wouldn't dare to dream of." The man looked up, his expression one of surprise and, perhaps, admiration. "You really?" Tommy nodded, his eyes distant as he thought back to the days he'd spent in combat, the friends he'd lost, the scars, both visible and invisible, that he carried with him every day. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I've served. I've fought. And I've come home to a world that barely remembers." The stranger's gaze softened, a flicker of respect finally surfacing in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that Tommy hadn't expected. "I shouldn't have judged you. I didn't realize what you'd been through." Tommy looked at him, his own expression softening slightly. "It's not just about me," he replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "There are so many like me, men and women who gave everything and came back to nothing. People assume they know us, that they can look at us and understand. But they don't." The man nodded, a look of understanding dawning on his face. "You're right," he said, almost to himself. "I didn't think about it that way." For a moment, they stood in silence, an unspoken truce settling between them. Tommy could see the man's guilt, his regret, and in that moment, he realized that this encounter had been more than just a clash of prejudices. It was a reminder, a small chance for someone to learn, to see beyond the surface. As the man handed Tommy a small wad of cash, Tommy hesitated, feeling the weight of pride tugging at him. But this time, he didn't refuse. He accepted it with a nod, grateful not for the money, but for the understanding that had finally, even if belatedly, surfaced between them. As the man walked back to his family, a thoughtful expression lingered on his face. He seemed quieter, less confident, and maybe even a little ashamed. His family glanced at him, curious but saying nothing. Tommy watched them, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He hadn't expected an apology, certainly not an understanding, and yet, here it was. It didn't change the years of struggle, the nights spent on cold sidewalks, or the judgments that came with it. But it was something, and sometimes even small things mattered. The waitress returned to clear Tommy's table, a warm smile on her face. "You handled that well," she said softly, admiration clear in her eyes. Tommy nodded, offering a faint smile. "Guess I've learned a thing or two about patience over the years." They shared a quiet moment, both recognizing the weight of what had just happened. The diner was nearly empty now, with only a few late-night patrons left. The hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen created a soft, comforting background. Before leaving, Tommy took a last look around, absorbing the warmth and light that contrasted so sharply with the chilly night outside. He thanked the waitress, and she gave him a gentle nod, as if to say that he'd always have a place here, a moment of respite amidst the struggles. Stepping out into the brisk night air, Tommy felt a renewed sense of purpose. That brief moment of understanding had sparked something inside him, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't entirely lost to the world. He looked up at the stars, the same stars he had looked at many nights in foreign lands, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. After Tommy left the diner that night, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. The apology from the wealthy man lingered in his mind, stirring up memories he had tried hard to suppress. Nights on cold city streets, feeling invisible to the world, had almost erased the sense of pride he once felt as a decorated veteran. Yet, for the first time in years, he sensed that someone had truly seen him, not as a man down on his luck, but as a human being with dignity, strength, and worth. As Tommy walked through the quiet streets, he felt the weight of his past lifted, if only slightly. The encounter replayed in his mind, not just for the apology, but for the realization that, despite everything, his life still mattered. It gave him the courage to consider the possibility of rebuilding, even if he was unsure where to start. Days passed, and Tommy kept returning to the diner, finding comfort in its warmth and the familiar faces of the staff who had always treated him kindly. He struck up conversations with a few regulars, sharing parts of his story when they asked. At first, he hesitated, fearing their judgment. But to his surprise, people listened, drawn in by his resilience and spirit. Word spread, and more people began to greet him, offering nods, smiles, and sometimes even a handshake. A simple gesture that meant the world to a man who had grown used to being overlooked. One day, the diner manager approached him, offering a part-time job clearing tables. It wasn't much, but it gave Tommy a sense of purpose and a reason to keep moving forward. The job connected him with the community, giving him a role to play and a place to belong. And with each day that passed, he found his voice growing stronger, his confidence building little by little. A local journalist, having heard about Tommy's story, came to the diner and asked if he could write about him. At first, Tommy felt nervous, unsure if he wanted his life displayed in public. But something deep inside urged him to share, not for himself, but for others like him. Veterans who had been forgotten, whose sacrifices went unseen. He hoped that by telling his story, he could inspire compassion and understanding, and maybe spark a change in how people viewed homelessness, especially among veterans. The article was published, featuring a photo of Tommy standing proudly in front of the diner. People read his story, some even recognizing him as the man they had walked by countless times, never knowing the depth of his experiences. Donations began to pour in, some from strangers, others from people who wanted to help in any way they could. With this support, Tommy managed to secure a modest studio apartment, his first real home in years. Over the following days, Tommy found himself reflecting on the encounter more often than he would have expected. It had opened old wounds, but in a way, it had also healed something deep inside. He realized that his life, his sacrifices, and his hardships weren't invisible after all. Even if most people didn't understand, some did. And that was enough. He began visiting the diner more often, gradually building a connection with the staff and other regulars. He started to share his story with those who showed interest, speaking about the men he'd served with, the battles they'd faced, and the scars they all carried. Word of his story spread, and before long, the community began to see him as more than just another face on the streets. He became a symbol of resilience and honor, an example of the strength it took to survive both war and the return home. People would occasionally stop him, offering a few words of thanks, a cup of coffee, or even a small donation, helping him feel a renewed sense of belonging. As winter turned to spring, Tommy found himself looking toward the future with cautious hope. The community's support allowed him to find a modest apartment, giving him a place to call home for the first time in years. His dignity restored, he no longer felt the sting of judgment from passers-by, and he walked the streets with a quiet pride that spoke to the strength he had always carried within. One evening, as he sat by his window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he thought of the man who had unintentionally set this change into motion. He wondered if that stranger remembered him, if he had shared the encounter with his family, perhaps using it as a lesson on empathy and understanding. He didn't need to know. He just hoped that somehow it had made a difference. In his quiet apartment, surrounded by a few belongings and memories of both hardship and hope, Tommy finally felt that his journey had come full circle. His story, once shrouded in struggle and loss, was now one of resilience and redemption. He had fought many battles, both on foreign soil and at home, and he had won them all, not through force, but through endurance and unwavering pride. And as he closed his eyes that night, he knew that he was, indeed, a hero, not only in the eyes of others but, most importantly, in his own. Settling into his new apartment, Tommy looked around the bare but clean space, marveling at how far he had come in such a short time. For years, he had drifted, feeling like a ghost in a world that had moved on without him. But now, with a roof over his head, a steady income, and a renewed sense of purpose, he felt as though he was finally reclaiming his life. One evening, as he sat by his small window watching the city lights, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the people who had extended kindness, the diner staff who had treated him like family, and even the wealthy man who had seen him as nothing more than a beggar, yet ultimately learned the truth. Tommy found himself surprisingly grateful for that man, as the encounter had been a turning point, igniting a spark within him that he had thought long extinguished. The community's support continued, with local veterans reaching out to him, some asking for advice, others just looking for someone who understood. Tommy became a quiet leader, guiding those who struggled, helping them find resources, and reminding them that their service was valued, even if the world sometimes seemed to forget. Eventually, Tommy was invited to speak at a community event honoring local veterans. Nervous but determined, he stood before the crowd, sharing his story not as a tale of hardship but as a testament to resilience. His words resonated with the audience, many of whom were moved to tears, seeing not just a man who had endured, but a man who had triumphed. Afterward, people approached him, thanking him for his service and his courage. Among them was a young man who admitted he had once been quick to judge homeless people. Tommy's story, he said, had opened his eyes, teaching him that everyone deserved empathy, regardless of their circumstances. For Tommy, this was perhaps the greatest reward, a sign that his story had created real change, however small. In time, Tommy became known as a pillar of his community, a man who had risen from hardship to inspire those around him. The shadows of his past no longer haunted him. Instead, they stood as reminders of his strength, a testament to a life marked by courage and resilience. Years later, as he sat with friends on a park bench, watching children play nearby, Tommy felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place in the world, not defined by his struggles, but by his triumphs. And he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same unwavering spirit that had carried him through the darkest nights. In his heart, he was a soldier still, a man of honor who had fought not only in battles overseas, but also in the battle for his own life. And he knew that, in the end, he had won. Subscribe for more interesting stories and tap the notification bell icon for future updates.